Vivienne Kensington, had 90 days to get married, or she would lose control of a $40 billion empire. Arthur Caldwell just had his electricity shut off, desperate to keep custody of his 7-year-old daughter. Their worlds shouldn't have collided, but a catastrophic board meeting and a spilled cup of cheap diner coffee forged a contract born of pure desperation. It was supposed to be a simple transaction, a fake marriage, no feelings. But Arthur demanded one condition that changed everything. Vivienne Kensington stood at the apex of the Manhattan skyline, her tailored Chanel suit acting as armor against the vultures circling inside her own boardroom. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Axiom Holdings headquarters, mirroring the tempest brewing around the mahogany conference table. Axiom was a juggernaut in the global logistics and tech sector, a company Vivienne had bled for over the last decade. Yet, none of her profit margins or hostile takeovers mattered to the 12 older men sitting behind their leather portfolios. At the head of the opposition was her uncle, Charles Kensington. He adjusted his silk tie, a predatory gleam in his eyes. The grandfather clause is quite clear. Vivienne, Charles said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. Jonathan Kensington was a man of traditional values. When he established the family trust, he stipulated that the controlling 51% of Axiom shares would only transfer to the acting CEO upon their 35th birthday, provided they demonstrated familial stability. Specifically, a marriage. You turn 35 in exactly 89 days. Furthermore, our upcoming merger with the Walton-backed consortium in Dallas is hanging by a thread. They are a conservative family. Your independent lifestyle and those photos on page 6 last month have made them incredibly nervous. Vivienne kept her face an unreadable mask of ice. Forbes had recently dubbed her the Ice Queen of Wall Street, a title she wore with pride. My personal life has yielded a 20% year-over-year growth for this company. Charles, the Dallas Consortium cares about revenue, not a ring on my finger. They care about optics, Charles countered sharply. And so does the board. If you are not legally wed by midnight on your 35th birthday, the shares default to the secondary beneficiary, me. I will step in as CEO, and my first act will be to finalize the Dallas merger on my terms. The silence in the room was deafening. Vivienne looked at the corporate lawyers, who all lowered their eyes. The trust was ironclad. Her grandfather, a brilliant but stubbornly archaic patriarch, had designed it to force her into settling down. She had spent her entire adult life avoiding the vulnerability of love, building an empire so high nobody could touch her. Now, that very empire was slipping through her fingers because she lacked a husband. You will have my marriage certificate before the deadline. Vivienne lied smoothly, picking up her leather briefcase. Meeting adjourned. She walked out of the boardroom with her head held high, but internally, her mind was a chaotic war room. She needed a man, not a partner, not a lover, a pawn. Someone who could pass a background check, look presentable at charity galas, and most importantly, someone who could be bought for a lump sum and an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Miles away, in a damp, crumbling apartment in Queens, Arthur Caldwell was staring into his own personal abyss. Arthur sat at a scratched Formica kitchen table, his hands calloused and permanently stained with motor oil. Scattered across the table was a mountain of final notices, medical bills, utility threats, and legal fees. In the next room, the soft, rhythmic sound of a nebulizer hummed. His 7-year-old daughter, Maya, was taking her evening asthma treatment. Arthur ran a frustrated hand through his dark, unruly hair. 6 months ago, His small independent auto repair shop had been crushed by a predatory real estate developer who bought his building and quadrupled the rent. Since then, Arthur had been working grueling double shifts at a commercial garage, but it barely covered rent and Maya's specialized medical care. Worse than the bankruptcy was the envelope sitting at the center of the table, a summons for family court. His ex-wife, Vanessa, had left them 3 years ago to chase a wealthy lifestyle in Europe. She was back, engaged to Brent Harper, a ruthless Wall Street hedge fund manager. Vanessa had suddenly decided she wanted to play mother again. Backed by Brent's unlimited legal fund, she was petitioning for full custody, arguing that Arthur's financial ruin and cramped living conditions made him an unfit parent. "Daddy," a small voice called out. Arthur immediately plastered a warm, reassuring smile on his face and walked into the living room. Maya was curled up on the faded sofa, the plastic mask over her nose and mouth. She looked so incredibly small. "Hey, Bug," Arthur said softly, sitting beside her and stroking her hair, breathing, feeling a little easier. Maya nodded, pulling the mask down. "Are we going to have to move again? Daddy, I heard you on the phone with the lawyer man." Arthur's heart shattered, but he kept his voice steady. "No, sweetie. I'm just figuring out some adult stuff. We are staying right here. Nobody is taking you away from me. I promise." It was a promise he had no idea how to keep. His lawyer, a cynical public defender, had told him the brutal truth that afternoon. Unless Arthur could show a massive change in his financial circumstances, at least $100,000 to secure a better home, establish a college fund, and hire a top-tier pediatric specialist for Maya's medical records, the judge was going to rule in Vanessa's favor. Brent's mansion in the Hamptons looked a lot better on paper than Arthur's unheated apartment in Queens. Arthur kissed Maya's forehead, put her to bed, and walked back out to the kitchen. He grabbed his worn canvas jacket and headed out into the torrential rain. He needed to clear his head. He needed a miracle. The neon diner in Hell's Kitchen was a relic of a bygone New York. It smelled of stale grease, burnt coffee, and desperation. At 11:45 p.m., it was nearly empty. Vivienne sat in a corner booth, shivering slightly in her damp designer coat. She had directed her driver to drop her off blocks away to escape a pack of aggressive paparazzi who had staked out her penthouse, following the rumors of the board's ultimatum. She was nursing a cup of black coffee, aggressively scrolling through a list of elite matchmaking services on her phone. Every wealthy bachelor her fixer had suggested was either too ambitious, too proud, or wanted genuine influence over Axiom Holdings. 2 booths down, Arthur was nursing his own cup of coffee. His phone was pressed to his ear, and he was trying to keep his voice down. Though the diner was so quiet, his gravelly tone carried easily over the sound of the rain. "I don't care what Brent's lawyers filed," Arthur hissed into the receiver. "Vanessa didn't call on Maya's birthday for 3 consecutive years. Now she wants to play house because it looks good for Brent's country club applications. You have to buy me more time, Greg." Vivienne didn't normally eavesdrop, but the raw, unfiltered panic in the man's voice caught her attention. She discreetly glanced over. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a faded mechanic's jacket. He had striking, angular features, tired eyes, and an air of fierce, caged energy. "I know the judge cares about stability," Arthur continued, rubbing his temples. "I need 50 grand just to retain the kind of counsel Brent has. I need a miracle. Greg, I'll sell a kidney if I have to. Just don't let them take my daughter." Arthur hung up, slamming the phone face down on the sticky table. He buried his face in his hands, completely defeated. Vivienne's mind, always engineered for ruthless efficiency, began to connect the data points. Desperate, needs money, fiercely loyal to a child, unconnected to the corporate circles of Wall Street. Before she could overthink it, Vivienne picked up her coffee cup and slid out of her booth. She walked over and slid into the vinyl seat directly across from Arthur. Arthur looked up, startled. His eyes narrowed, taking in her immaculate grooming, the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, and the cold, calculating expression on her face. "Booth's taken," he grumbled, assuming she was a lost tourist or a drunk socialite. "Your lawyer is wrong," Vivienne said smoothly, her voice a low, cultured murmur. $50,000 won't secure a top-tier family law attorney in Manhattan. You need a retainer of at least 150. Plus, you'll need an influx of liquid assets to prove financial superiority to the judge. Arthur stared at her. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Vivienne Kensington. I am the CEO of Axiom Holdings, and I believe we can solve each other's problems tonight." Arthur let out a harsh, dry laugh. "Lady, whatever you're selling, I can't afford it. Have a good night." "I am not selling anything. Mr. Caldwell, Arthur Caldwell." "I am buying, Mr. Caldwell." I couldn't help but overhear your predicament. You are in danger of losing custody of your daughter due to a lack of funds. I am in danger of losing my company due to a lack of a husband. I am offering you a business contract. You will marry me. Sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement waiving any claim to my corporate assets, and stand by my side at public events for the next 2 years. In exchange, I will deposit $1 million into your bank account tomorrow morning, tax-free, and my corporate legal team will absolutely destroy your ex-wife in family court. Arthur froze. The diner's neon sign flickered outside, casting strange shadows across Vivienne's flawless, impassive face. She looked like a beautiful, terrifying machine. "You're out of your mind," Arthur whispered. "People don't just buy husbands in diners. They do when they stand to lose $40 billion. Time is a luxury I do not possess. Arthur, do a background check on me if you wish. Bloomberg, Forbes, the Wall Street Journal. I am exactly who I say I am. I require a partner who will not try to interfere with my business, who will ask no questions, and who understands this is purely transactional." Arthur looked at the woman. $1 million. It was enough to buy a house in a great school district, hire the best doctors for Maya, and crush Vanessa and Brent in court. It was the exact miracle he had just begged the universe for. "Transactional," Arthur repeated slowly. "Entirely," Vivienne confirmed, pulling a gold pen and a business card from her bag. Arthur leaned forward, the exhaustion vanishing from his posture, replaced by a sudden, protective steel. "If I do this, it's not just my life you're messing with. It's Maya's. Family court judges aren't stupid. Ms. Kensington, if I suddenly marry a billionaire out of nowhere, they will investigate. If they catch wind that this is a fake arrangement, I will lose Maya permanently for committing fraud. My public relations team is the best in the world. We will manufacture a believable romance." "Not good enough," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that made Vivienne blink in surprise. No one spoke to her with that kind of command. "If we do this, it's on my terms." Vivienne crossed her arms. "I am offering you $1 million. You are hardly in a position to dictate terms." "Keep your million," Arthur said softly, his eyes locking onto hers with a burning intensity. "If I'm going to marry you, we do this my way. Condition 1. We live together, for real. You move into my world, or I move into yours, but we share a roof. Condition 2. You spend time with my daughter. You will look that judge in the eye and prove you are a devoted stepmother." Vivienne's jaw tightened. I do not have time to play house with a child. Then find another husband to save your empire, Arthur said, sliding out of the booth and standing up. He looked down at her, unwavering. Condition 3. A penalty clause. If you break character, if you get tired of this little game and abandon us, ruining my custody case, you forfeit $20 million directly into an irrevocable trust for Maya. Vivienne stared at the grease-stained mechanic towering over her. He wasn't a pawn. He was a king fighting for his most precious treasure, and he had just backed the Ice Queen of Wall Street into a corner. "Draw up the contract," Vivienne whispered. "We get married on Friday." Friday morning arrived with the suffocating humidity, typical of a Manhattan summer, but inside the climate-controlled lobby of Vivienne's Fifth Avenue building, the air was brisk and sterile. Arthur pulled his rusted 2012 Ford F-150 into the circular driveway, the squealing brakes drawing horrified looks from the liveried doorman. He killed the engine and turned to look at his daughter. Maya was clutching her battered plush rabbit, her eyes wide as she stared up at the towering glass and steel monolith. "Okay, Bug," Arthur said, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness. "This is it, our new adventure." Maya coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made Arthur's chest tighten. "Is the lady going to be mean, Daddy? Like the wicked stepmothers in the cartoons?" "No," Arthur promised, unbuckling her seatbelt. "She's just very busy, but she's going to help us." 30 floors up, Vivienne was pacing the expanse of her triplex penthouse. The apartment was a monument to minimalist wealth, cold white marble, jagged modern art, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Central Park. Her crisis management team, led by a ruthless public relations director named Beatrice Gallagher, was assembled around the dining table. "The narrative is simple," Beatrice balked, handing Vivienne a leather-bound dossier. You didn't go to a matchmaking service because you are an independent, modern executive. You met Arthur 3 months ago when your Aston Martin broke down on the BQE. He fixed your alternator. It was a whirlwind romance across socio-economic lines. The media eats up that Cinderella in reverse garbage. The private elevator chimed. The polished steel doors slid open, and Arthur stepped into the penthouse, holding Maya's small hand. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal gray two-piece he had bought at a discount store 5 years ago for a funeral. It was slightly tight in the shoulders. He looked wildly out of place, a rugged, calloused mechanic standing in a fortress of high fashion. Vivienne stopped pacing. She looked at Arthur, and then her gaze dropped to the little girl, hiding behind his leg. Maya was tiny for a 7-year-old, her pale skin highlighting the dark circles under her eyes, a side effect of the heavy asthma medications. "Welcome," Vivienne said, her voice stiff. She had commanded boardrooms of hostile billionaires, but facing a nervous child rendered her utterly speechless. Beatrice immediately swooped in, her eyes scanning Arthur with predatory assessment. "Suit needs to be burned. We have a tailor from Tom Ford coming in an hour. We need to get you looking less blue-collar and more eccentric artisan. And the kid." "The child's name is Maya," Arthur interrupted, his voice low but carrying a razor-sharp warning. He stepped slightly in front of his daughter, shielding her from Beatrice. "And nobody is dressing her up like a prop. If we are doing this, you treat her with respect." Beatrice scoffed, turning to Vivienne. "Are you sure about this guy, Viv? He's a liability, a loose cannon." "He is my fiancé, Beatrice," Vivienne said coldly, surprising herself with how quickly she jumped to Arthur's defense. "And he is right. Maya is off limits to the press. No photos, no interviews. I will not exploit a minor to appease the board. Arthur's posture relaxed slightly, and he gave Vivienne a curt nod of gratitude. Vivienne walked slowly toward them, crouching down so she was at eye level with the little girl. She didn't know what to do with her hands, so she awkwardly rested them on her knees. "Hello, Maya. I am Vivienne." Maya peeked around her father's leg. "My dad said you have a big house because you buy and sell boats." "Ships," Vivienne corrected gently. "Cargo ships, mostly. But yes, I have quite a bit of space here. There's a bedroom down the hall that has a view of the park, and I had my assistant ensure the air filtration system was upgraded to hospital-grade standards. It should help with your breathing." Arthur stared at Vivienne, genuinely stunned. Upgrading the HVAC system wasn't in the contract. It was an act of unsolicited consideration from a woman who supposedly had ice in her veins. "Thank you," Arthur said softly. "Don't thank me yet," Vivienne replied, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "We have to be at City Hall in 3 hours. Beatrice has leaked the location to exactly 3 friendly media outlets. We need photographs of the ceremony to submit to the trust lawyers by 5 p.m. Are you ready, Mr. Caldwell?" "Let's get it over with, Ms. Kensington." The Manhattan Marriage Bureau was chaotic, smelling of cheap perfume, nervous sweat, and damp wool. Outside the courthouse, the orchestrated leak had worked too well. A horde of paparazzi was barricaded behind police lines, shouting Vivienne's name. Inside, the private ceremony room was suffocatingly small. Arthur stood at the front, now wearing a perfectly tailored navy Tom Ford suit that transformed him from a struggling mechanic into a striking, formidable presence. Even Vivienne, standing beside him in a sleek ivory Carolina Herrera suit, had to admit he looked like he belonged on the cover of GQ. Maya sat quietly in the front row, holding the hands of one of Vivienne's imposing security guards. "Do you, Vivienne, take Arthur to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the officiant droned on, rushing through the standard vows. Vivienne's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her grandfather's archaic trust. She thought of Uncle Charles gloating in the boardroom. "I do. And do you, Arthur, take Vivienne?" Arthur looked at Maya, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. He thought of Vanessa's smug lawyers and the threat of an empty apartment. "I do. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." They hadn't practiced this. The contract didn't specify the mechanics of physical affection. Vivienne turned to Arthur, her eyes wide, panic briefly cracking her icy facade. Arthur hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently placing his large, warm hands on her waist. He leaned in, and Vivienne closed her eyes, bracing for a clumsy, forced collision. Instead, his lips met hers with surprising gentleness. It was a brief, firm kiss, meant only for the cameras snapping through the glass partition of the door. But a strange jolt of electricity shot down Vivienne's spine. When he pulled away, his dark eyes held a silent question. "Are you okay?" And she managed a tight nod. By 4 p.m., the marriage certificate was scanned and emailed to the Axiom Board of Directors. By 4:30 p.m., Charles Kensington was violently sweeping a crystal decanter off his mahogany desk. "A mechanic!" Charles roared, staring at the tablet screen displaying the marriage license. Standing across from him was Victor Rossi, a high-priced corporate fixer who specialized in destroying reputations. "Arthur Caldwell," Rossi confirmed smoothly. "Bankrupt, facing a brutal custody battle. He married your niece today. It's obviously a sham, Charles. She bought him to secure the shares." "Prove it," Charles snarled, gripping the edges of his desk. "Dig into everything. his debts, his ex-wife, his kid. I want this marriage annulled for fraud before the Dallas merger closes. Destroy him. Monday morning arrived with a different kind of war. Family Court, Part 42. Arthur sat at the petitioner's table, his hands sweating. The courtroom was a grim, paneled room that smelled of floor wax and despair. Across the aisle sat Vanessa, draped in designer silk, looking bored. Next to her was Brent Harper, her billionaire hedge fund fiancé, flanked by 3 aggressive, high-powered attorneys. "Your Honor," Vanessa's lead attorney began, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed Judge Patricia Higgins. "Mr. Caldwell's living conditions are deeply unsafe for a child with severe chronic asthma. He is drowning in debt, recently evicted from his business, and lives in a mold-infested, unheated apartment. My client, on the other hand, can provide Maya with a stable, luxurious home in the Hamptons and the best medical care money can buy. We ask for immediate physical custody." Judge Higgins frowned, looking down at Arthur's file. "Mr. Caldwell, this financial affidavit is concerning. How do you intend to provide for the child?" Arthur took a breath, preparing to speak, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The low murmur of the court immediately silenced. Vivienne Kensington strode down the center aisle, flanked by Jonathan Cole, the most feared and expensive litigator in New York. Vivienne looked immaculate, terrifying, and completely in control. Vanessa's jaw dropped. Brent Harper sat up straight, his face draining of color. Everyone on Wall Street knew who the Ice Queen was. Vivienne walked through the swinging gate and took the seat right next to Arthur, placing her manicured hand over his trembling one. It was a calculated move, but her touch felt strangely grounding. "Your Honor!" Jonathan Cole boomed, stepping up to the podium. "Apologies for the dramatic entrance, but opposing counsel's file is woefully out of date. As of Friday, my client, Arthur Caldwell, is legally married to Vivienne Kensington. Maya Caldwell currently resides in a $40 million Upper East Side penthouse, equipped with a hospital-grade HEPA filtration system. Furthermore, her stepmother has established an irrevocable $20 million medical and educational trust, solely in Maya's name." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. "Furthermore," Cole continued, turning a lethal glare toward Brent Harper, "we have compiled records of Ms. Vanessa's travel logs over the last 3 years. 3 birthdays missed. 0 pediatric pulmonologist appointments attended. The only reason she is petitioning for custody now is because Mr. Harper is attempting to join the ultra-conservative Oakwood Country Club, which requires its board members to portray a wholesome family image. They are using this child as a country club accessory." Brent shot to his feet. "That is an outrageous lie. Sit down, Mr. Harper," Judge Higgins snapped, slamming her gavel. She looked from Brent's flushed, guilty face to Arthur and Vivienne. Vivienne was looking at Arthur with an expression of fierce, practiced devotion. "I need time to review these new documents," Judge Higgins said, her tone softening. "But based on the establishment of this trust and the change in residency, I am denying the emergency motion to remove Maya from her father's care. We will reconvene in 30 days for a full custody evaluation. Case adjourned." As the gavel fell, Arthur let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a year. He slumped back in his chair, overwhelming relief washing over him. He turned to Vivienne, completely forgetting their audience, and pulled her into a fierce, crushing hug. Vivienne froze, her arms pinned to her sides, but as Arthur buried his face in her shoulder, murmuring, "Thank you, thank you," a strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in her chest. for the first time in her life. The Ice Queen slowly raised her arms and hugged him back, across the room. Vanessa narrowed her eyes, pulling out her phone. She didn't know how Arthur had pulled this off, but she knew the Kensington family, and she knew someone who would pay very well to uncover the truth. The transition into shared living was a seismic shock to Vivienne's meticulously curated existence. For the past 5 years, her penthouse had operated with the sterile efficiency of a museum. Everything had its designated place, and absolute silence was the baseline. By Wednesday morning, that silence had been thoroughly shattered by the sounds of Saturday morning cartoons echoing from the media room and the clatter of pans in the gourmet kitchen. Vivienne emerged from her master suite at 6 in the morning, dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer and matching trousers, a Bluetooth earpiece already flashing as she listened to the overnight Asian market reports. She walked into the kitchen expecting her private chef to have her standard green smoothie waiting. Instead, she found Arthur. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt that stretched tightly across his broad shoulders, a dish towel thrown over one shoulder, expertly flipping a pancake in a cast-iron skillet. The kitchen smelled of browned butter, maple syrup, and dark roast coffee, a stark departure from the scent of cold-pressed kale. Maya was perched on one of the steel bar stools, her legs dangling, happily drawing in a coloring book. "Good morning," Arthur said, noticing Vivienne freezing in the doorway. He plated a stack of pancakes and slid them toward Maya. "I told your chef he could take the morning off. The guy looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. I hope you don't mind. I make a mean blueberry flapjack." Vivienne blinked, tapping her earpiece to mute the market report. "My chef is compensated extremely well to not sleep, Arthur, and I do not eat carbohydrates before a board meeting." "Everybody needs carbs, Vivienne," Arthur replied easily, pouring a cup of coffee into a porcelain mug and holding it out to her. "Drink this. It's better than whatever green sludge was in that blender." Vivienne hesitated, her instinct to reassert dominance warring with the undeniable fatigue settled deep in her bones. She stepped forward, accepting the mug. Their fingers brushed, and she felt the rough, calloused texture of his skin against hers. It was a grounding sensation. She took a sip. The coffee was strong, dark, and perfect. "Thank you," she murmured, a rare concession. She looked at Maya, who was watching her with large, curious eyes. The little girl's breathing sounded clearer today, the hospital-grade HEPA filters, working exactly as Vivienne had intended. "I drew you a picture," Maya said softly, sliding a piece of paper across the marble island. Vivienne set her coffee down and picked up the drawing. It was a crayon rendering of a tall building, a small stick-figure girl, a larger stick-figure man holding a wrench, and a woman in a suit standing next to them. Above the woman's head, Maya had drawn a slightly lopsided golden crown. "I'm the Ice Queen," Vivienne said, a hint of genuine amusement touching her lips. "My public relations director would be thrilled." "Dad said you aren't an Ice Queen," Maya stated matter-of-factly, stuffing a piece of pancake into her mouth. "He said you're just carrying a really heavy backpack that nobody else can see, and that makes you stand up super straight." Vivienne's breath hitched. She shot a look at Arthur, who suddenly seemed very interested in scrubbing the cast-iron skillet, a faint flush creeping up the back of his neck. For a decade, the world had seen Vivienne Kensington as a ruthless machine. No one had ever looked at her armor and recognized it as a burden. The observation, relayed through a 7-year-old, pierced directly through a wall she had spent her entire adult life reinforcing. Before she could process the emotion swelling in her throat, her cell phone vibrated violently against the marble counter. It was a text from Beatrice Gallagher. Check page 6, now. Vivienne pulled up the browser. The headline screamed in bold black letters. Billionaire's bargain bin husband. Questions swirl around Axiom CEO's sudden courthouse wedding. Attached was a grainy photograph of Arthur in his stained mechanic's jacket outside the neon diner, followed by a side-by-side image of him in his Tom Ford suit at the courthouse. The article cited an anonymous source close to the family, claiming the marriage was a desperate, transactional sham to secure Vivienne's inheritance. Vivienne's blood ran cold. Charles, she whispered, her eyes narrowing. Across town, in the dimly lit, oak-paneled bar of the Oakwood Country Club, Charles Kensington was indeed hard at work. He sat in a leather booth across from Victor Rossi, his corporate fixer, and Vanessa, Arthur's ex-wife. Vanessa sipped a martini, her eyes glittering with calculating malice. I told you, Mr. Kensington. Arthur despises handouts. When we were married, he nearly killed himself working 3 jobs rather than take a loan from my parents. There is 0 chance he married your niece for love, and even less chance he accepted her money without a catch. We need proof, Charles said, swirling his scotch. Rumors in the tabloids will rattle the Dallas consortium, but to trigger the grandfather clause and seize the company, I need concrete evidence of fraud. The $20 million trust, Victor Rossi interjected, sliding a manila folder across the table. I have a contact at the bank. The trust Vivienne set up for the child was finalized hours before the custody hearing. But it's heavily conditionally escrowed. If Vivienne and Arthur divorce within 2 years, the funds are locked down. It reads exactly like a severance package for a fake marriage. Charles smiled, a cold, predatory grimace. Excellent. We subpoena the trust documents for the custody evaluation. We expose the financial coercion in family court, which makes the arrangement public record. Arthur loses this kid for committing fraud. Vivienne loses the company, and I step in as CEO. Vanessa leaned forward, tracing the rim of her glass. And Brent and I get Maya. Everyone wins, except them. Charles agreed, raising his glass. Tomorrow night is the Axiom Charity Gala. The Dallas executives will be there. We will spring the trap then. Let's see how well this mechanic plays the billionaire. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a dazzling sea of diamonds, tailored tuxedos, and ruthless ambition. The Axiom Holdings annual charity gala was the most coveted ticket of the Manhattan social season, but tonight it was a battleground. Vivienne stood near the entrance, a vision in a midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown that clung to her frame like liquid sapphire. She wore no jewelry save for the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring Beatrice had procured for the charade. Despite her outward perfection, her stomach was tied in knots. The Dallas Consortium executives, a group of conservative, old-money Texans who controlled the fate of her merger, were watching her every move. Arthur stood beside her, radiating a quiet, dangerous confidence. The Tom Ford tuxedo fit him flawlessly, his broad shoulders and natural, rugged posture making the Wall Street hedge fund managers around him look like boys playing dress-up. Breathe, Arthur murmured, leaning in close so only she could hear. His breath brushed against her ear, sending a sudden, involuntary shiver down her spine. You look like you're walking to the electric chair. If I lose the Dallas merger tonight, I might as well be, Vivienne muttered, maintaining her frozen, photogenic smile for the cameras. Remember the briefing. Do not discuss your past. Do not discuss the custody case. And whatever you do, do not let my Uncle Charles corner you. I handle broken engines for a living. Vivienne, I can handle a few rich guys in suits. The real test came an hour later. Vivienne was forcefully separated from Arthur by Beatrice, who dragged her to speak with a prominent senator. Arthur found himself stranded near the champagne fountain, immediately surrounded by the three key executives from the Dallas consortium, led by a silver-haired patriarch named Harrison Vance. From across the room, Charles Kensington watched like a hawk, waiting for the mechanic to crumble under the pressure of high society. "Say, so, Mr. Caldwell," Harrison boomed, swirling his bourbon. "Vivienne tells us you're an entrepreneur, independent investments. What exactly is your portfolio?" Arthur took a slow sip of his sparkling water. He knew the scripted lies Beatrice had prepared for him. Angel investor, tech startups, green energy. But looking at these men, Arthur knew they could smell a rehearsed corporate lie from a mile away. "I'm in the business of salvage and restoration," Arthur said smoothly, ignoring Beatrice's panicked signaling from across the room. "I find things that other people have discarded as broken or worthless. I tear them down to the foundation, find the mechanical failure, and rebuild them to run better than they did off the assembly line." Harrison raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued. "Real estate? Turnarounds?" "Machinery," Arthur corrected, a genuine smile touching his eyes. "Specifically, vintage automotive engines. But the principle applies everywhere, doesn't it? A company, a car, a family. You don't abandon something just because the timing belt snaps. You get your hands dirty and you fix it." Harrison stared at Arthur for a long moment, then let out a booming laugh that echoed over the string quartet. "I like you, Caldwell. God, it's refreshing to hear someone talk about actual labor instead of derivatives and hedge funds. You know, I have a '68 Mustang in my garage in Austin that's been giving me hell." When Vivienne finally managed to extract herself from the senator and rush back to Arthur's side, she fully expected a disaster. Instead, she found Arthur and the Dallas executives deep in a passionate conversation about carburetor tuning, the Texans treating Arthur like an old friend. "He's brilliant," Harrison told Vivienne, patting Arthur on the shoulder. "Keep this one, Vivienne. He's got more spine than half your board combined." As the executives walked away to take their seats for dinner, Vivienne stared at Arthur in shock. "What did you do?" "I told the truth," Arthur said, adjusting his cuffs. "Just dressed it up a little." Before Vivienne could respond, the crowd parted and Charles Kensington approached, flanked by Victor Rossi and, to Arthur's absolute horror, Vanessa. She was wearing a red silk dress, a predatory smirk plastered on her face. Vivienne, darling," Charles said loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. "What a spectacular evening. I thought I would bring a special guest, someone who knows your new husband intimately." Vivienne stepped slightly in front of Arthur, her protective instinct flaring instantly. "Charles, this is a private corporate event. Ms. Vanessa is not on the guest list. Security will escort her out." "Oh, I wouldn't do that," Vanessa sneered, stepping forward. "Not unless you want me to scream to everyone in this room that you bought my ex-husband to secure your inheritance. I have the subpoena for Maya's trust fund. Vivienne, the conditional clauses prove this is a business arrangement. You're committing fraud." The color drained from Vivienne's face. If Vanessa produced those documents here, the Dallas executives would walk out immediately. The merger would die on the floor, and Charles would call an emergency board vote in the morning. Arthur's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. He didn't care about the billionaires or the boardrooms. He cared about the threat to his daughter. "Vanessa," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm that made even Charles take a step back. "You have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out of this hotel. If you don't, I won't just fight you in family court. I will take the $1 million Vivienne gave me, and I will hire private investigators to tear apart Brent Harper's hedge fund. I know about the offshore accounts he uses to hide his clients' losses. You want to play dirty? Let's see how Brent's country club reacts to a federal indictment." Vanessa froze. The color vanished from her cheeks. She looked at Charles, panicking, realizing she had vastly underestimated the man she had abandoned. "Get out," Arthur whispered. Vanessa turned on her heel and fled toward the exit, nearly tripping over her own heels. Charles scowled, his face turning purple with rage. "This isn't over, Arthur," he hissed, before storming away into the crowd. The crisis was averted. But as the adrenaline faded, Arthur felt a sudden, sharp tug on his sleeve. Vivienne was staring at him, her icy composure completely shattered. Her hands were trembling. "You protected me," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. No one had ever protected Vivienne Kensington. She was always the one holding the shield. Arthur looked down at her, the fierce anger in his eyes melting into something dangerously soft. "Always," he said. The ride back to the Fifth Avenue penthouse was enveloped in a heavy, charged silence. The adrenaline from the Pierre Hotel gala was slowly fading from Vivienne's bloodstream, leaving behind a profound sense of vulnerability. She sat in the back of the Maybach, the city lights flickering across her face, hyper-aware of Arthur sitting mere inches away. He was staring out the window, his jaw clenched, still vibrating with the protective fury he had unleashed on Vanessa and Charles. When they finally stepped out of the private elevator and into the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, Vivienne let out a long, shuddering breath. She kicked off her Jimmy Choo heels and sank onto the plush velvet sofa in the living room. Arthur walked over to the antique bar cart, poured 2 fingers of Macallan scotch into a crystal tumbler, and handed it to her. "Drink," he said, his voice softer now, the dangerous edge replaced by the steady rumble she was growing accustomed to. Vivienne took the glass, her fingers brushing his. "You shouldn't have threatened Brent Harper with a federal indictment," she murmured, staring into the amber liquid. "If Vanessa calls your bluff, the resulting investigation could ensnare the custody battle in a media circus. It was reckless, Arthur." Arthur sat on the coffee table, directly across from her, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I wasn't bluffing. Vivienne, mechanics hear things. Before the garage went under, I serviced the cars for half the junior analysts at Brent's firm. They talk when they think nobody is listening. I have dates, offshore account names, and wire transfer amounts. If Vanessa tries to take Maya, I will burn Brent's world to the ground. But I won't let them touch you, either." Vivienne looked up, meeting his intense gaze. The realization hit her again, harder this time. She had spent a decade building an impenetrable fortress around herself, trusting no one, delegating every crisis to a team of lawyers and fixers. Yet, this man, a mechanic she had bought in a diner just days ago, had stepped in front of a firing squad for her without a second thought. "Why?" Vivienne whispered, the armor cracking. "Our contract doesn't require you to protect me from my uncle. You just have to smile for the cameras. Because you aren't just a boss or a business partner." Arthur replied, his dark eyes unwavering. "You gave my daughter a safe place to breathe. You bought her hospital-grade air filters before you even bought a wedding ring. I don't care about the Axiom shares, Vivienne, but I care about the people under my roof." For the first time in her adult life, Vivienne Kensington had absolutely nothing to say. The ensuing week brought a shift in the penthouse dynamic that terrified Vivienne's executive assistants. She started leaving the Axiom Tower at 5 o'clock. The ruthless CEO who routinely scheduled working dinners suddenly had unmovable personal obligations. Those obligations usually involved sitting on the floor of the media room with Arthur and Maya, helping the little girl assemble a complex 2,000-piece Lego set of the Millennium Falcon. Vivienne found herself noticing the small things. The way Maya's laugh sounded like bells. The way Arthur's shoulders relaxed only after he checked the locks on the doors at night. And the strange, comforting warmth of Arthur's hand casually resting on the small of her back when they stood in the kitchen. However, the fragile peace was shattered on a rainy Tuesday morning with the arrival of Dr. Elias Roth. Dr. Roth was the court-appointed family psychologist tasked with conducting the custody evaluation. He was a shrewd, humorless man who had broken hundreds of families on the witness stand. He arrived unannounced at 8 in the morning, carrying a leather briefcase and an expression of profound skepticism. "Ms. Kensington, Mr. Caldwell," Dr. Roth said, stepping into the foyer and aggressively wiping his shoes. "I apologize for the intrusion, but an accurate assessment requires observing the domestic environment in its natural, unscripted state." "Of course, Dr. Roth," Vivienne said, instantly slipping into her corporate persona. She smoothed her pencil skirt, gesturing toward the living area. "Can I offer you coffee? Breakfast?" "I am not here for hospitality," Roth replied sharply. He pulled a recorder from his pocket. "I am here because Mr. Charles Kensington submitted an anonymous addendum to the court yesterday. It alleges that this marriage is a financial transaction designed to circumvent a corporate trust, and that Maya is being used as a prop in a billionaire's tax and estate scheme." Arthur stepped forward, his body rigid. "My daughter is not a prop." "Then you won't mind if I speak with her alone," Roth countered, his eyes darting down the hall. For the next 2 hours, the penthouse felt like a hostile interrogation room. Roth inspected Maya's bedroom, scrutinized the medical logs Arthur kept, and grilled them individually on their relationship timeline. He pushed Vivienne relentlessly on her work schedule, questioning how a woman who managed $40 billion in assets could possibly have the emotional bandwidth to raise a chronically ill child. "You purchased a Cartier necklace last month that costs more than Mr. Caldwell's lifetime earnings," Roth noted dryly, sitting across from Vivienne in her home office. "Do you truly expect the court to believe you fell in love with a bankrupt mechanic? The socioeconomic disparity alone is a statistical anomaly." "I expect the court to look at Maya's medical records," Vivienne shot back, her voice dropping to a freezing temperature. "Since she moved into this home, her peak flow meter readings have improved by 40%. She has not had a single severe asthma attack. I am providing a safe, stable environment. My bank account is irrelevant to my capacity for care." "Dr." Roth clicked his pen, making a note in his ledger. "Care can be outsourced, Ms. Kensington. Real parenting cannot. We will see how this family holds up under real stress." Unknown to Vivienne, the stress was already being orchestrated. Across the city, Charles Kensington was sitting in his corner office, listening to a manipulated audio file provided by a private investigator. It was a spliced recording from the Neon Diner, stitched together from the ambient noise. "I need 50 grand. I'll sell a kidney. You will marry me. $1 million. Charles smiled, dialing the number for the head of the Dallas consortium. The evaluator was just a distraction. The real execution was scheduled for the Axiom board meeting on Friday. He was going to play the tape, void the marriage, and take the throne. Friday morning arrived with the suffocating pressure of a ticking time bomb. It was the deadline, the day the Axiom board would finalize the Dallas merger, and the day Vivienne officially turned 35, triggering the grandfather clause that would secure her 51% controlling stake. Provided her marriage withstood the final scrutiny, Vivienne stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her bedroom, securing a pearl earring. She wore a striking, crimson Alexander McQueen suit, a deliberate choice of armor for the bloodbath she anticipated in the boardroom. Arthur stood behind her, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. He was attending the meeting as her legal spouse, the ultimate prop in the final act of their corporate theater. "You look ready for war," Arthur said, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection. "Charles will try something today," Vivienne replied, her voice taut. "He's been too quiet since the gala. Just follow my lead, Arthur. Once the Dallas executives sign the merger at noon, the trust shares lock into my name irrevocably. After that, Charles can scream fraud all he wants. The company will be mine." Before Arthur could reply, his cell phone rang. It was the school nurse at Maya's private elementary school. Arthur's face drained of color as he listened. "How bad? Did you administer the rescue inhaler? I'm on my way." He hung up, tossing his tie onto the bed. "It's Maya. She had a severe asthma attack on the playground. Her oxygen levels tanked. The ambulance is taking her to Mount Sinai Hospital." Vivienne froze, the pearl earring slipping from her fingers and bouncing on the hardwood floor. Mount Sinai was in the opposite direction of the Axiom headquarters. It was 10:45 a.m. "Go!" Vivienne said immediately, grabbing her phone to call her driver. "I will have the car waiting downstairs. I'll alert the pediatric pulmonary wing at Mount Sinai to have a team ready in the emergency bay." "Vivienne, the board meeting," Arthur said, his voice raw with panic. "If you aren't there when the Dallas consortium arrives, Charles will call a vote of no confidence. You have to go to the office." Vivienne looked at Arthur. She thought of her grandfather's legacy. The decades of 80-hour work weeks, the sacrifices, the sheer ruthless drive that had defined her entire existence. Then, she thought of Maya's crayon drawing, the Ice Queen carrying a heavy backpack. "Axiom is a company," Vivienne said, her voice steady, stripping off her crimson blazer. "Maya is my daughter. Let Charles have the boardroom. We are going to the hospital." The chaotic lights of the Mount Sinai emergency room were a blur. When they burst through the double doors, they found Maya in a glass-walled trauma bay. She was pale, a heavy oxygen mask strapped to her face, a team of doctors hovering over her. Arthur rushed into the room, gripping Maya's tiny hand, tears streaming down his face as he murmured reassurances. Vivienne stood just inside the doorway, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She watched Arthur desperately try to soothe his child, and the last, stubborn wall of ice around her heart shattered completely. This wasn't a contract anymore. This was her family. An hour later, a nurse confirmed Maya had stabilized. The crisis had passed. Arthur sat in a plastic chair beside the hospital bed, his head resting in his hands. Vivienne stepped out into the hallway, pulling out her phone. It was 1:15 p.m. She had 40 missed calls from Beatrice Gallagher and a dozen from the corporate legal team. She ignored them all and dialed Jonathan Cole, her ruthless litigator. "Jonathan," Vivienne said quietly, "prepare the severance documents. Charles won the vote, didn't he?" "Vivienne, where the hell are you?" Jonathan's voice barked through the receiver. "Charles played a manipulated audio tape of you and Arthur in a diner to the Dallas executives. He claimed extortion. He called for an immediate vote to terminate you for corporate fraud and moral turpitude." "I know," Vivienne said, closing her eyes. "Let him have it. Let him have it." Jonathan laughed, a sharp, triumphant sound. "Vivienne, You didn't let me finish. Charles tried to call the vote, but Dr. Elias Roth walked into the boardroom at 11:30 a.m. Vivienne's eyes snapped open. The custody evaluator. Yes, Jonathan continued, gleeful. Dr. Roth apparently had a scheduled meeting with Vanessa and Brent Harper this morning. Vanessa slipped up. She bragged about Charles paying a private investigator to fabricate the audio tape and trigger the asthma attack by having Brent's people stress the child at school. Dr. Roth realized the entire custody petition was a coordinated attack on you. He marched into Axiom, presented the real, untampered evidence to the Dallas executives, and threatened Charles with federal witness tampering and child endangerment. Vivienne leaned heavily against the cold hospital wall, the breath rushing out of her lungs. The merger, Harrison Vance, excuse me, Harrison, the Dallas lead, refused to sign with Charles. He said he only does business with people who fix things, not people who break them. They signed the merger contingent on your signature. The grandfather clause triggered at noon. You own 51%. Vivienne, it's over. You won. Vivienne slowly lowered the phone. She had won the empire. But looking through the glass at Arthur, who was gently brushing the hair out of a sleeping Maya's face, she realized the empire was the least valuable thing she possessed. She walked back into the room. Arthur looked up, his eyes red and exhausted. Did you lose it? He asked softly. Axiom. No, Vivienne said, walking over and sitting on the edge of the narrow hospital bed, resting her hand over his. Charles is out. The company is mine. Arthur let out a breath, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. So, the contract is fulfilled. You got what you needed. You don't have to stay here. Vivienne. I know hospitals aren't your scene. Vivienne looked down at their joined hands. The $1 million, the non-disclosure agreements, the fake smiles for the paparazzi. It all felt like a lifetime ago. The contract was a 90-day arrangement, Vivienne said softly, looking up into his dark, steady eyes. But I have a new term to negotiate. Arthur's brow furrowed in confusion. What term? Vivienne leaned in, her gaze dropping to his lips before meeting his eyes again with an absolute, terrifying sincerity. I want to tear the contract up. I want to fire the lawyers, cancel the escrow accounts, and do this for real. No clauses, no exit strategies, just us. Arthur stared at the Ice Queen of Wall Street, seeing the raw, unguarded vulnerability shining in her eyes. He didn't hesitate. He reached up, pulling her face down to his, and kissed her. Not for the cameras, not for the board, but because he couldn't imagine spending another day of his life without her. Monday morning at Axiom Holdings did not begin with a standard board meeting. It began with the arrival of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Vivienne stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee that Arthur had brewed for her before she left the penthouse. Below, in the rain-slicked plaza of the financial district, 2 federal agents were escorting Charles Kensington out of the building in handcuffs. Dr. Elias Roth had not made empty threats. The family court evaluator had turned over the evidence of Charles's extortion, wire fraud, and witness tampering directly to the authorities. Paying a private investigator to fabricate audio was a crime, orchestrating a severe asthma attack by bribing a schoolyard monitor to lock Maya's inhaler in a gym locker elevated the charges to child endangerment. The Axiom Board of Directors had unanimously voted to strip Charles of his shares and sever all ties to protect the Dallas merger. The door to Vivienne's office clicked open, and Jonathan Cole stepped in, looking remarkably smug. He dropped a thick manila folder onto her mahogany desk. "Charles just lost bail privileges, due to being a flight risk," Jonathan announced, adjusting his tie. And the fallout in family court was even more spectacular. Judge Patricia Higgins didn't just deny Vanessa's custody petition. She granted Arthur sole legal and physical custody, terminating Vanessa's visitation rights pending a psychiatric evaluation. Vivienne turned around, a genuine, unburdened smile breaking across her face. "And Brent Harper." Jonathan let out a dark chuckle. "Arthur wasn't bluffing about the offshore accounts. Once Charles went down, Arthur made one phone call to his old mechanic buddies. They handed over a ledger of Brent's unlogged financial transfers, hidden in the glove compartment of a restored Aston Martin. The SEC raided Brent's hedge fund at dawn. His assets are frozen, his country club membership has been revoked, and Vanessa has completely abandoned him to flee to a secluded villa in Spain." Vivienne walked over to her desk, running her fingers over the leather portfolio. The war was over. The empire was secure. But as she looked around her massive, immaculate office, she realized it felt entirely different. It was no longer a fortress designed to keep the world out. It was just a place she worked. Her real life was waiting for her uptown. 6 months later, the Manhattan skyline was painted in the warm, golden hues of autumn. Arthur stood wiping motor oil off his hands with a rag, admiring the gleaming chrome engine of a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro. He wasn't in a cramped, commercial garage in Queens anymore. He was standing in the center of Caldwell Restorations, a sprawling, high-end vintage auto shop in Brooklyn. Vivienne had offered to buy the building for him out of her personal accounts. But Arthur had stubbornly refused. Instead, he had secured a small business loan using the first legitimate profits from his consulting work with Harrison Vance's Dallas fleet. He was rebuilding his life with his own 2 hands, exactly the way he wanted. "Daddy, look!" Arthur turned as the heavy bay doors of the garage slid open. Maya ran inside, her cheeks flushed with healthy color, her breathing perfectly clear. She was holding a bright blue ribbon. Behind her walked Vivienne, dressed down in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking more radiant and relaxed than any financial magazine had ever captured. "First place in the science fair," Vivienne announced, her eyes shining with fierce pride as she walked up to Arthur, wrapping her arms loosely around his waist. "She built a working miniature wind turbine. I didn't even have to help her wire the battery." Arthur scooped Maya up, spinning her around until she giggled, completely unbothered by the grease smudging his hands. "That's my brilliant girl. How about we celebrate with pizza tonight? Extra cheese, no green sludge." "Deal," Maya cheered, wiggling out of his arms to go inspect a stack of fresh tires in the corner of the shop. Arthur wrapped his arm around Vivienne's shoulders, pulling her close. The physical affection between them was no longer practiced or stiff. It was as natural as breathing. "You skipped a quarterly revenue meeting for a second-grade science fair," he teased softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The Wall Street Journal is going to revoke your Ice Queen title." "Let them," Vivienne murmured, leaning into his warmth. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "Actually, I have some paperwork for you." Arthur raised an eyebrow, taking the envelope. He broke the wax seal and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents. It was their original marriage contract, the 90-day agreement, the non-disclosure clauses, the penalty stipulations, and the prenuptial financial waivers. Every single page had a massive red void stamped across it, signed by Jonathan Cole and notarized by the state of New York. "I had the lawyers dissolve the escrow accounts this morning," Vivienne said, her voice dropping to a soft, vulnerable whisper. "The fake marriage is officially legally terminated, Arthur. All the escape clauses are gone." Arthur looked from the voided contract to the woman standing in front of him, the woman who had bulldozed her way into a diner, bought him for $1 million, and accidentally saved his entire world. He slowly ripped the thick stack of papers in half, and then in half again, tossing the shredded pieces into a nearby metal trash can. "Good," Arthur said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, burning with absolute certainty. "Because I'm never letting you go. Sometimes, the most broken circumstances lead to the most beautiful restorations." Vivienne and Arthur started as a desperate business deal, but they ended up building a love more powerful than a billion-dollar empire. True family isn't about perfect beginnings. It's about who stands by your side when the storms hit. If you love this dramatic journey of the Ice Queen and the Single Dad, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a great plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-to-life stories.